Go. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending upon where you are. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I forgot to hit record. There we
Turn
go.
it over.
I need to start it over. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're delighted to have Peter Mann with us today to talk about his brand new book, World Pacific. And Barbara was reminding us that we did a fun program with Peter for the Torqued Man. And I'll go ahead and put a link to that program here in the comments field. And yeah, so if you have any questions for Peter, go ahead and type them in. And Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any of your questions. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, Peter, it's lovely to see you again. I
Yeah,
just
likewise, Barbara.
reminded
Thanks for
Peter
having me
that,
back.
oh, you're welcome. I just reminded Peter that I graduated from Stanford, where he's teaching in 1962. So I suspect that I went to my 45th reunion and I didn't recognize a number of things, but the basic Stanford campus, the quad, all of that, still there, right?
There are a few buildings, yeah, it's gradually being dwarfed by all sorts of newfangled 21st century constructions. I don't recognize, I'm there every week and I don't recognize it half the time. So,
You know,
always in flux.
I had that same experience when I went to London a year ago last June for a crime conference, and I went out on the Centennial Bridge and I looked down towards the Tower of London, and you can't see it now.
Wow.
It's totally dwarfed by, the glass high rises and all the rest of it. It's even happening here in Scottsdale. So I think you're right. I think 21st century, building architecture, what people want from their buildings, totally different.
It's true. Unfortunately, they often lack a soul too. So, they might have all the high-tech plugins, but then there's something lost.
Well, I think Mem Chu, for those of us who went to Stanford Memorial Church, for those of us who didn't and wonder what I'm talking about, it'll probably stay forever. And part of that is that it has some wonderful mosaics. So
That's right. Yeah, beautiful. Till the next earthquake.
yep. So I hope that the university will not allow the basic club to go away. But anyway, and partly the reason I brought that up is we're going even further back in time than 1962. In this book, we're going back to 1939. And Peter, you seem to have an obsession with World War II. So I mean, the Torqued Man, you were dealing with the Irish and a German connection in in the war. And in this book, we're still dealing with the Germans. But this time it's a lot more fun. Tell us what drags you into the war.
Can't get away from that war. Can't get away from those pesky Germans either, huh? Um, yeah, I suppose two books start to make an obsession, or at least a preoccupation. Maybe by the third book, you can fully diagnose me as obsessed. It's part of it, I think, is I've just been steeped in that period for such a long period of time, ever since I was a teenager, and then in college, my interest took me into modern European history, into early 20th century, and I kept that up in graduate school. So part of it is just I've uploaded so many things into my brain that this is that writing novels is one way to try to clear the deck, so to speak. But a more substantive answer is it's formed the world as we know it. You know, we live in the wake of its destruction and the New World Order made after 1945. To me, that period between the two world wars and then right after, it's it's there's somewhere in there between 1918 and 1945. Some world died and a new one took shape, and it died, I think, several times. And it's kind of a miracle that life kept going on and reinventing itself. And so I'm just drawn to stories that come out of the ashes and the tumult of that period, and the moral compromises people make, and the acts of self-invention, and collaboration and resistance that come out of that period.
And here we are again, remaking the world
Here we
order
are again. Yeah,
as we
exactly.
speak.
I don't think we have to stretch very far to talk about the relevance of the 30s and World War II era. Now we're trying to fight the same fight here and plagued by the same forces. So
Absolutely true. I'm trying to remember Graham. What is his last name? It'll come to me in a minute. Graham Moore. Lovely guy, also Californian. And his last thriller was really, I thought, completely fascinating. It was about the economics behind World War II, and particularly the push by Britain to retain the pound sterling as the world monetary standard and the determination of the Americans to change over to the dollar. And
Wow.
yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects to that period, as you say, the 30s and then World War II, that they continue to fascinate, and they really did remake the world from the British Empire, but maybe what we're now living through is the British Empire died away and the American came up. I have a feeling the Washington Post called where we are at the moment the suicide of a superpower, and I felt like that was pretty much apropos. Maybe it won't be. Maybe it will all go in a different direction, but maybe it won't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting. It feels like this finally this erosion of the post-war
Yeah.
order that people, back in the 90s were so naive and triumphant to think that, oh, this is just how life's going to be from now on, right? The history's over. Um, and yeah, we're far from it. We're caught in the flux, and so it's the crumbling of this post-war order, and yet, like you said, it's also we find ourselves repeating certain moments that led up to that war and the making of that order. I think we've, at least some of us, realize how precious and fragile institutions like liberal democracy and humanism are, and so I think that's also something I'm drawn to, in in scouring the past for some sort of analog in the present, trying to orient myself in the present by looking somewhere else than here. Because here, if you just look in the present, I'm always amazed at people that write contemporary fiction because it's trying to get some sort of meaning or order out of both the mundanity and the chaos of life that you actually live. I find much more challenging than to try to divine some sort of analog orientation by looking somewhere else.
I'm an historian by training at our alma mater and in graduate work. And I came to a conclusion, this is the last thing I will say about where we are. I came to the conclusion the other day that we're actually not dealing with fascism. We are reverting to monarchy and in particular to the Tudor court. And if you know your history of, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth and all the rest. That's exactly what we're seeing. The tech bros are turning into like Sir Walter Raleigh and all those guys. We know who Henry is. And I find that so interesting that pattern that we broke, the French Revolution, all of the things that got us away from absolute monarchy and to the idea of, democracy and all. We're reverting back. And you have to ask yourself whether at heart people just want to be told what to do. They want stability, they want security, and they're willing to give up stuff in order to achieve it. So I've really been thinking about that because I'm probably a walking authority on Britain in the 15th through the 17th century. I mean, that's something I've been to Oxford,
Yeah.
studied it there, took a class from my tutor, Mr. Pitt. And why didn't Britain have a revolution when the French did? Part of the answer is they already had one. It didn't work out well, so I mean, I suddenly thought to myself, first I thought, no, we're back in the 1930s, but I'm not sure we're not back actually in like the 1540s.
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of historical rhymes with every era. Absolutely. It doesn't just
Absolutely.
have to be one.
So you like not only World War II, this era, you're in 1939, but you do like real historical figures in your books. So what we have here, so apparently you really like Thomas Mann, German again, German coming in here. And so you have his two daughters as part of the players in this book. But Sir Richard Halliburton, I mean, Richard Halliburton, Lord, I love those kinds of books. I grew up on not by him, but who are the guys that wrote Scaramouche and all those marvelous King Solomon's Mines, all those marvelous kind of
Yeah.
fantastical adventures. Also, Flash Gordon and the Emperor Ming. I love Flash Gordon and the Emperor Ming, and all. And so, but Richard Halliburton was a real historical sort of what Errol Flynn who wrote.
That's not a bad way of putting it. Errol Flynn who wrote. I like that. There's definitely a dash of Errol Flynn in him, and I think I've added a couple more dashes in my figure of the character Dickie Halifax, who is modeled I would say by turns loosely and quite closely on Richard Halliburton. He was, yeah, he's this writer, adventurer, kind of celebrity best-selling author of the 20s and 30s. He would go to all these far-flung places and kind of get himself into tight scrapes and then find a way out of them. And that became the stuff of his books. And he came up with this kind of semi-heroic, semi-buffoonish literary persona of him as the kind of bumbling hero of his books, and people ate it up at the time. And by 1939, you have the beginnings of what we're going to come to call World War II are already taken shape in the Asia Pacific. Japan has been bombarding China already for a few years at that point. Strangely, in that moment, Richard Halliburton gets this idea to his latest adventure to sail a custom-built Chinese junk, an old sailing ship, from Hong Kong to San Francisco. And the idea was that he was going to arrive in Treasure Island, which is this man-made island in the San Francisco Bay. I can almost look at it right here from my window, where they had the 1939-1940 World's Fair. So this is this grand moment. There was a theme of Pan-Pacific unity, and Halliburton was supposed to arrive on this ship to grand fanfare, and then he was a bit of a financial schemer too, and so he was going to make all of his money back on this grandiose project by giving pleasure cruises around the San Francisco Bay in his ship. And of course, he never made it. He disappeared in the middle of the Pacific, about 500 miles away from Midway Island. We think he's never heard from again. At least that was his last transmission, and 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 then he vanished. And he only lived on, I think, in his books and his readers, but they really fell from people's interest pretty quickly too. He got World War II essentially took the spotlight away. So I was just really, when I read about him as this figure, I was drawn to this grand adventure, kind of like you said. I didn't grow up reading Halliburton either. He was totally unknown to me until a few years ago. But I always loved as a kid reading those young adventurer kind of novels. For me, the Landmark series of books were fantastic, historical, kind of real history, but packaged for 12-year-old boys and girls with an adventurous mindset. Pretty potted history, I imagine. Any event, I saw an opening there for a story, and I saw an opening for a thoroughly comedic voice, I hoped, in that one of the salient details I read about the real Halliburton in this trip was he tried to raise funds for it by selling a subscription package of letters that he would mail. He would write aboard his ship across the Pacific and mail at various ports of call en route to his young readers. So boys and girls from age like 10 to 14 to get these letters. And I thought, oh, what if my character, Dickie Halifax, is writing letters to his young boy readers, even after he's, quote, disappeared in the Pacific, but as readers will soon discover, he is alive, though not well.
So there's been a big thing recently about Amelia Earhart and trying to figure out, what happened to her. Has anybody displayed any interest in trying to figure out what happened to Halliburton and his Chinese junk?
It's a good question. I've come across a few articles in the last 10 years or so that speculate, that write about him. There was a piece in the Smithsonian some years ago. It doesn't come to any new conclusions. I don't know if there are any wreckage hunters or deep sea divers who have actually gone after it. As far as I know, no tangible evidence has ever been found. But he's the exact same vintage too. Halliburton disappeared only what 2 years after Amelia Earhart disappeared. Not, I think, to our best knowledge, she disappeared somewhere around Papua New Guinea, and so Halliburton's not too far from the scene there. So whatever vortex is in the middle of the Pacific, maybe they're
Like
both
the
living it up
Bermuda
still.
Triangle, right?
That's right.
Well, I mean, it's, I think there's thought that the airplane might have actually crashed on some island or something, some discernible wreckage where if he went down in the Pacific, full fathom five or whatever it is, then the odds are poor that you'd find it. Although saltwater does preserve wooden ships, if you've ever been to Stockholm and visited the Vasa Museum, which
I
is one of
have.
my favorite
Yes.
places. And even they brought up, was it the Mary Rose? The King Henry, back to Henry VIII, one of his flight, and they have to keep. They brought up it was one of Henry VIII's ships, And they brought it up, but they have to keep spraying it all, because the wood has to be kept wet now in order for it to, which is true of the Vasa as well. They can't dry it out or terrible things will happen.
Yeah, that ship museum is amazing. I remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
so well, if they ever can find out where the sea dragon is on the seafloor of the Pacific, then it'll be in grand shape, I'm sure. Although
yeah,
I have a feeling it was
exactly.
torn to smithereens. He was caught in a typhoon, as far as we know. That was his
Ah,
last radiogram was essentially reporting that they were in a typhoon, these huge squalls and gale force winds, and in typical Halliburton fashion, even though I don't think he actually drafted this radiogram. It still has his voice, which is something like, bunk soaked, lee rails underwater, gale force winds, having a great time. Wish you were here instead of me. And that was the last word Halliburton ever spoke.
well, if the ship broke up, then there we are. We will not find it. But anyway, back on Treasure Island. So we have Halliburton sailing from Hong Kong in his Chinese.
Halifax.
Sorry,
Sorry to correct you.
getting
Yeah.
confused up. Sorry. All right. So we have Halifax in his Chinese junk. Um, with his slightly skeevy money raising scheme, sailing towards Treasure Island. And who is on Treasure Island? Because the World Fair was a really big deal. There have been a number of books written about, things that went on in the World's Fair in San Francisco Bay. I find it interesting that Alcatraz, which I can remember was a big thing when I was an undergraduate, might be coming back into service after
Oh,
it, has
yeah.
been. So anyway, San Francisco Bay may get our attention again in a different way than it has for a long time.
Yeah, so the World's Fair, I can say a bit more about the World's Fair in 1939, 1940. Like I said, Treasure Island is a man-made island. If you drive across the Bay Bridge today, it's broken right into two sections, and you pass through the actual natural island of Yerba Buena, this little rocky island, and then adjacent to that, basically attached onto Yerba Buena, they filled the shoals and just used sand to create this artificial island. And originally it was supposed to be the San Francisco airport. I think that was the idea. And then they thought, hey, we just finished building the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge. They finished within a couple of years of each other in the mid 30s. And they thought, hey, we should have a World's Fair here, celebrate it, and draw tourists from all across the country out west. And so they converted what was a kind of incipient airport in that there were already, I think at the time of the World's Fair, you had the Pan Am Clipper ships that would fly off from Treasure Island from the bay, and they would make a pretty incredible circuit, a 5-day circuit from San Francisco to I think you could fly to Hong Kong, but you could fly to Manila, Yokohama, but of course they're stopping at every place, right? At Honolulu, at Midway, um, Guam. So, any event, they had this island and they used it for this fair, and this fair drew all sorts of different historical figures. Diego Rivera was there painting a mural. There was there was this place called the Gateway that was more of a kind of carnival amusements with, guess your weights and test your strengths and things like that. But the most popular attraction at the Gateway, and I believe the most popular attraction of the whole fair, beyond all these more edifying cultural uh, attractions and international pavilions, was this place called the Nude Ranch. And it was run by a burlesque star named Sally Rand. And
Sure, the fan, Sally Rand,
yeah,
and
yeah,
her
she did the fan
fans.
dance.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, she was referred to, one of her epithets was her sexcellency. So these are the kinds of things you read in history and you just realize you have to steal wholesale. That there's no need to change a thing except I changed her last name. But I knew that something of such delightful local color as the nude ranch had to feature in this story somehow. And so that was part of the fun and the challenge is to figure out a role. How can the nude ranch play an integral role in the story without it just being a gratuitous add-on, not just simply saying like, hey, look here, here's some burlesque dancing, but rather how can if I'm telling the story of this adventurer who gets shipwrecked at sea and comes back in altered form to San Francisco. And I hope I'm not giving it away in the sense that this is kind of the arc of the story. Halliburton is declared dead at the beginning of the book. Excuse me. I'm doing it too. I'm calling my character hit by
It's hard
historical
not
novel.
to, right?
Hard not to, but I assure you, damn it, this is a novel. So Halifax is declared dead, and then we quickly learn he's alive, and a large part of his harrowing ordeal is getting him prepared to return in altered form to San Francisco. So this story comes to a head, and my different narratives all come together in San Francisco on Treasure Island.
Right. Well, tell us about the two children of Thomas Mann, particularly painter Hildegard Rauch, who is, that's who she is, right? But with the name change once again.
Yeah, well, so she's an I would say that Thomas Mann's daughter Erica Mann is certainly an inspiration, but there are all sorts of ways to more than a name has been changed in the sense that Erica Mann, as far as I know, never painted anything. She was
Oh,
a writer and a a kind of theater producer and performer in her younger years. She had a she had part of the tension I adopt for the novel is this drama that both, I suppose, all the children of Thomas Mann, he had several children, but the two I focus on in particular as models for this novel are his two oldest children, Erika Mann and Klaus Mann. They weren't twins, they were a couple years apart only, but they're very close. And so I've turned them into twins, Hildegard and Hank Rauch, who are the children of a very Thomas Mann-like figure, Theodor Rauch, who is often described as Germany's greatest living writer in exile. And I have him living in Los Angeles like the real Thomas Mann eventually did when he immigrated. He kind of came to Princeton in the late 30s and eventually ended up in Los Angeles in 1940-41 with so many German and Jewish and Central European immigrants, so much so that Los Angeles in the 30s into the 40s constitutes such an immigrant enclave that it was known as Weimar on the Pacific. And there's a real sense I think we can't really understand Hollywood culture and in some sense American culture during World War II and mid 20th century without taking into account the role that these Central European immigrants played in shaping American culture then. So I have Hildegard as the daughter of this illustrious writer who is trying to basically keep out of the shadow of her father, who she has a benevolent but aloof relationship toward, but he exerts this kind of gravitational pull, as the real Thomas Mann did. And her brother, Hank, is not so fortunate. He's been sucked fully into the orbit of his father and overshadowed by him. And so part of the drama is that ensues and that will eventually involve my Dickie Halifax character and all of this intrigue that comes together is how do you navigate having a world famous father who's being called upon, multiple times a week at this point in 1939 to speak on behalf of democracy and become a spokesperson for the anti-Hitler opposition, who also is then neglecting terrible aloof father, and so part of Hildegard's drama is understanding and investigating this family drama that then is involved in a much larger, I would say, world historical intrigue, if we will.
right. Well, that it's also true. There have been a number of crime novels written about it, that there were extensive Nazi sympathizers in California. And, I've read quite a few. And also in the Midwest, the Missouri, Wisconsin had significant numbers, but really there was a lot to keep an eye on, especially in California. And of course, we also had the Japanese community, but I think that they were largely wronged in terms of internment. I don't think there's as much compelling evidence. I shouldn't say that. I don't know enough. But I haven't read much compelling evidence that the Japanese were engaged in espionage on behalf of Japan. Whereas I think there is significant Nazi sympathizing and, that kind of thing. And also the communists were busy, the Comintern I think a lot of Americans, especially on the left, and that was true in Europe too, we're sort of entranced by communism. And for a while, when the war started, Russia was a there was a I never quite understood how people sort of managed Russia making, allied with Germany and then making a left turn, and not allying with Germany. I also never understood why Hitler didn't read about Napoleon and not go to Russia. I mean, talk about repeating, the same error. Um,
Yeah, I think hubris might explain some of it.
no kidding. But at the same time, so you had these kind of two opposing things going on. We had three things going on in America for sure. You had Nazi sympathizers, you had a Japanese community that was being sort of, looked at with more than askance, with real hostility. And then you had communist sympathizers over here, and then you had like regular Americans. So it was a mess.
Yeah, that's right, and that's
What did
precisely.
you say about it? The problem with America is that everything here is a cartoon. Um, I don't know that I mean, I was born in 1940, so I'm not an actual eyewitness, except for the very end of the war. But I think that because we had such an enormous immigrant population, and we're such a big country, we could embrace all kinds of um, people and all kinds of different agenda and belief systems and behaviors.
Oh, I think that's right. So that line comes from a character, the third character who I haven't mentioned,
Right.
yet, who's a British intelligence officer. His name is Simon Falk, and
Mhm.
he has a very distorted perspective in the sense that I mean, I think there are cartoonish elements of American culture to be sure. We don't have to look much further than the Oval Office, but he is not happy to be where he is, which is assigned to San Francisco, posing as a vice consul and is tasked with ferreting out Nazi spies in
Nazi
California.
sympathizers that I've been mentioning, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So just
Yeah,
like you said, so at this point, this is one of the things that drew me to this moment and thinking about the different overlapping circles and political contexts that come together in California, which are yeah, not just California, but so much of the states was rampant with Nazi spies up until the FBI essentially turned a blind eye. They didn't have a counterintelligence operation at all until the very
yeah,
end of the 30s, and so they only started taking their spy problems seriously towards the end of the 30s, and they got the British to help them before there was ever any kind of formal arrangement. There was some under the table dealings between the British and the Americans in sharing intelligence and addressing this problem. So you have, and it's not just Nazi spies. I should add that at this point in time, you have out and out Nazis who are not hiding their identity or allegiances at all. You have the German American Bund,
right.
which is made up of homegrown Americans of German descent or of various links to German heritage who are holding Hitler rallies in what was called Hindenburg Park in Los Angeles, or they're filling Madison Square Garden. You can see photographs of George Washington and Adolf Hitler side by side in these kind of rallies. So the Nazi movement was alive and well, and in some ways flourishing well up in through the 30s, shortly before America's involvement, which is also this interesting period you mentioned. I just wanted to tag on to that. So my book takes place in the early part of the war before American involvement. So
Right.
right. So you have this interesting period of the fall of 39 after Hitler invades Poland, all the way up until December of 41 with Pearl Harbor, where America's, there's some involvement in terms of economic, like sale of arms, like I said, this illicit but they're not they haven't declared war, so they're bystanders largely, and the American sentiment is fairly it's changing in this period, but it's aloof. It's something that's happening over in Europe, right? I think it's
That's
a
right.
I'm drawing on today.
America was not happy at getting sucked into World War One, and then you had trying to remember Robert La Follette and the Midwest very much against very much isolationist, whatever. In fact, I don't know how many people realize that we never declared war on Germany until they declared war on us. I mean, after Pearl Harbor, we still did not commit to the war in Europe. We did go to war with Japan, and that was another dumb Hitler move. Not only did he go to Russia, but he declared war on America. And if he hadn't done that, it's possible that our entry, which I think was inevitable, but I think it would have been delayed. But the other parallel with where we are at the moment is that people were really unhappy with all the economic deprivations, all the terrible things that happened to ordinary people in the 30s, where people lost their jobs, lost their they were desperate, whatever. And I think that coming out of COVID certainly and other things has produced a kind of similar thing going on here in America, which always seems to drive people to the right, because things have been chaotic, and it's natural to want to blame something rather than, because that at least gives you some illusion of control. It's not me, it's that guy's fault. And I think that was very prevalent in the late 1930s here in America, and I think we're seeing it right now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think even though FDR obviously is present then, and there's like quite a different atmosphere in terms of coming out of the executive power, there's still a kind of bewildering blind spot on the part of so many institutions of government. I'm thinking the FBI in particular, in terms of not really seeing the right as a threat until it's already completely materialized and started to engulf them. Whereas they're highly attuned to a kind of paranoid degree, just like you said, with the focus on right possible Japanese espionage. Right, they're overly concerned about that, fueled by racism, just like they're overly concerned about the communist threat, even though that was a real threat too. It was something you mentioned, I wanted to come back to too. But there was this phrase they used called premature anti-fascist. A premature anti-fascist was, and this really gets trotted out after World War II and throughout the war, but it starts right before, where people who were kind of overly concerned about fascism, as in being opposed to fascism, before America got involved in fighting the fascists in World War II. So if you had gone to Spain and fought in the Spanish Civil War to defend the Spanish Republic against Franco, or anything like that, then you might find yourself targeted by the FBI. You might find J. Edgar Hoover developing a dossier about you because you were just a little too anti-fascist before the tide had turned. And even after World War II, this becomes a kind of the you can see the groundwork linking, I think, the Red Scare of the 20s to the McCarthyism after the war. That's a continuous vein there. It's even more complicated by the fact that in that interesting window is talking about 1939, 1941 is also, like you said, the Nazi-Soviet pact. So you have an alliance between these two ideologies that claim to be diametrically opposed to one another. And yet, in hindsight, we can see so many of the similarities of a Hitler and a Stalin and the, the yoked ideologies of totalitarianism. But for people living that at the time, to have gone from being an anti-fascist who's part of this Popular Front government, or this Popular Front uh, a league that was essentially, fueled by the Comintern, which was essentially a Soviet-controlled uh, international cultural organization that claimed to be this anti-fascist front, but really that was taking its orders from Moscow. This is gets so in 1939 when they declared this alliance and then proceed to carve up Poland between each other, Hitler and Stalin, you have people on the left who all of a sudden have to just gag themselves, right? Stuff their mouth with their socks and to now not say a bad word about Hitler. Because now Hitler is in alliance with Stalin, and Stalin is the vanguard of human liberation, and now the enemy is the imperial forces of democracy of Great Britain and the United States. So it's this totally morally, politically convoluted period where people are making all sorts of contortions in order to and acts of complete spinelessness and cowardice and anti-intellectual betrayal, which obviously rings true today too. So that was something that an echo I wanted to draw out in the book hopefully rings in people's ears today.
Scary how history repeats itself, a lesson that historians like me already know. But, and it usually takes, a couple of generations, maybe three, to forget everything and start over again.
Right.
And, because there's hardly anyone alive today now who is a World War II veteran. They've all gotten, well, they've aged out. So we have, I remember being in Berlin. I can't remember how long ago it was, but not hugely long ago. And we had a guide, and he absolutely did not have any clue about what he was showing us. I mean, he really didn't. Um, it's like there's a whole younger generation of Germans who either prefer not to have ever learned about the Nazis um, or just haven't learned about them. Whereas the Japanese, I think, have held on to their World War II history in a much larger degree. I've been to Japan quite a lot, and Germany, and I'm going back to Japan, in fact, in October. But they seem to me to be um, sort of living with it. Of course, they
Yeah,
also
I think
have
they've held on to their blind spots a bit too, in the sense that there's, I think, a sense of Japanese nationalism that plays on that to this day. But I I think I kind of see it as two ways, a double-edged sword in terms of this every generation or two, the amnesia you mentioned, in the sense that with World War II, I think the forgetting the fact that we have so little lived experience of the war is no longer memory. It's now firmly in the realm of history. I think that does, and this is, I think, one of the great things about history is, and why when people say like, how can you study or write about World War II or X subject or Tudor England? Hasn't everything ever been written about that already? Well, it's because no, like history is this malleable changing thing that changes based on one's perspective. So people live new lives in the present. They're going to have new interpretations of the past. And so I think we can now look back on World War II and start to question some of these narratives that we've inherited. And maybe some of those narratives they captured something that was true about the period, but maybe they were also blind to many other things. And I think this kind of greatest generation narrative about World War II and this heroic fight, certainly the idea that America got involved in World War II to fight the Nazis is a pretty easy one to deflate. It's something that we kind of constructed as a moral story ex post facto. So I think that this kind of forgetting that inevitably happens also opens the way for looking at history afresh, whether it's in fiction or in just straight research historical narratives.
Well, sure it does. For one thing, you can never have a full picture of it while you're living it. I mean, it
Yep.
does require historical perspective, and gathering up stories that would not necessarily come easily to you at the time. So let's go back and talk about, I love this, your Junior Adventurers fan club. So in this period, certainly in the 30s, I referred I mean, way back at the beginning of this conversation to Flash Gordon in The Emperor Ming. But there were, in fact, we had the Hardy Boys. We have, radio programs that were, I mean, when I was a child, the radio was where we got our stories, pre-television. And I can remember Saturday mornings, there was like a whole stream of, you know, um, adventure stories that we could tune into. And I think we kids were kind of, especially boys, I think, were kind of shaped by, that idea that because we all are tribal. I mean, this was a tribe, right? That you could join, whether you wanted to be, Frank Hardy and whatever. What is it? I can't remember the other one's name, Frank and whatever.
I don't remember.
Um,
I read some Hardy Boys way back
yeah,
when.
of course
Yeah.
you did, but I think that, the very term Junior Adventurers Club, I mean, now Boy Scouts are sort of regarded with opprobrium, but, that was a really big thing when I was young. We all wanted to be brownies, and then we all wanted to be Girl Scouts, and we had uniforms, and we had den mothers, and we did cool things together. And, it was also true for the boys. I'm not I'm not aware that a lot of that is still going on, part of it because information has come out that some of that was really injurious to children. But we did have that idea of a band of boys. It was almost like the Lost Boys, I mean, you read Peter Pan and you kind of get the
Oh
same
yeah.
thing. There's Wendy, but the Lost Boys were that was the deal, and join up and fly away to Never Never Land.
Yeah, it's funny you said the Lost Boys. I mean, so there's definitely a Peter Pan element to Dickie Halifax and him trying to kind of hang on to eternal boyhood. And I think part of the conceit that I loved about him writing to his young boy readers is in some sense he's trying to remain a boy at heart, but he's also undergoing this increasingly horrific ordeal at sea in a Japanese penal colony, and then even when he comes home that that is completely inappropriate for boy readers. So I loved the idea,
Yes.
or I love the idea of being able to address uh, young readers while in that kind of breezy, upbeat tone, while then narrating the most horrific experiences, as well as some I hope hilarious vulgar ones that involve Dickie in his trials. So that was a lot of fun for me, and I think yeah, that being able to play with the kind of levels of inappropriateness, but also I do love that boyish energy. If maybe you remember back in our conversation about the Torque Man, there I think one of the things that kind of threw me into the boys dimension of this project was out in the wild forests of Berlin and the Grunewald are these kind of outlaw teenage boy gangs called the
Yeah, it's
Wild.
Robin Hood, right? I mean,
Yeah. And
very
so I
neat.
played with those characters and I had so much fun writing the Wild Boys of Berlin that I thought, oh, I'd like to work, not exactly in that mode, but tap into some of that energy and that voice that that kind of devil may care attitude and rebelliousness and childishness and I had a lot of fun with it. And I knew that there was going to be a moment where Dickie, upon returning, encounters in the flesh some of his junior adventurers, and that they could play a role too. So that was fun engineering too.
So one of the reviewers of your work wrote this, which is apropos of what we're just saying. There's a touch of Chandlerist noir thrown in for good measure as well. For anyone willing to suspend disbelief in the vein of a boy story lover, enthralled by a tale of double crossing and improbable daring and enlivened with Chaucerian ribaldry, this is a rollicking good read. So I
Oh
thought
man.
you summed it up pretty well. I forgot about the Chaucerian ribaldry, which we haven't, this is not a R-rated program, but there is certainly some of that. I can tell you had a good time. Now, it's almost impossible to read this without seeing Errol Flynn. So, who is no longer with us, but nonetheless, has there been any film interest? Because I can certainly imagine that, especially with AI now, techniques for
Oh
the
yeah, we should dig
feeling.
Errol up and put him in AI
Well,
and play
not
this
just that,
role.
but I mean to do a believable Chinese junk, in a typhoon in the Pacific is much more possible now than it would have been if they'd put a little ship in a bathtub
Yeah,
and tried to film it.
that's true. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to venture into that old hornet's nest of how we should or shouldn't use AI in film production. Uh, I would have told you no, we shouldn't. But then if you said, well, they might make your book into a movie if you allow some of it, then I'd be like, well, let me think about that again. No film interest yet, but the book's just come out. Hollywood's going through a weird kind of contraction and renovation. So I think big time period pieces aren't the order of the day right now. But
But they may come back. We're all going into sort of a reaction to the woke thing. We had an Australian author here on Sunday, and she, looking at America from Australia, said that that is kind of how they're looking at it, and that's true, things tend to swing from one thing to another. And you
oh
can
yeah,
even see
yeah,
it
and I
in
think that
publishing. If you look at so many of the books being published, they were conceived and brought out in a highly woke moment. And now they're going to flounder to some degree, because for one thing, there's too many of them. But for another, the mood is kind of shifting in a different direction. And it takes a while, especially in publishing, when it takes so long for a book to, come come to readers. That I think we're gonna see that. And Hollywood too, I mean, it takes a lot of money, a lot of effort to put together, showrunner package, the whole nine yards. Um, so
Right. Oh yeah. No, yeah,
yeah,
I think you're right. It always takes a while to separate the fad from actual quality. And in the rush of the moment, sometimes people can't distinguish the two. But I mean, that's why I like to study history. I think having some
sure.
years removed, right, always makes everything a little clearer in the
If you'd
rear view.
only put a dragon in the book, you'd probably have a better chance at
Oh
the
God, yeah. Well, I
nomination.
draw the line somewhere. But there's a boat that Richard Halliburton's boat was called the Sea Dragon, but
There you are.
Richard Halifax's boat is called the Sea Dumpling. So, you,
No, not
yeah. So
nearly as.
no
No,
dragons, no
no,
dragons.
too bad. Dragon would have been much more exciting. Well, I can see that you've had a wonderful time writing both your books. What is it you're thinking about? Are you already contemplating a new book, even though this one has just emerged?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've got a couple things on the burner. I can't say much about it yet. It's still taking shape, but I'm working on two things. I'm working on another novel that'll definitely be historical and comedic and hopefully with some suspense that will probably go further back in time. I'm guessing it's going to go back as far as at least as the aftermath of World War One, so 1918-ish, and probably a little farther forward in time. I'm not quite sure. So, and then I'm also working on a graphic project. So I do comics as well.
I know you do, right?
And yeah, so I'm working on graphic novel is the term that gets kind of used for everything, even nonfiction. So I'm working on a history that's going to be seems to be taking shape about 19th century French literature as in
So
comic that sounds for a comic.
is your Substack thing called the Quixote Syndrome?
Yeah, the Quixote syndrome. Yeah,
Right, a comic dedicated to history, literature, and the absurd.
that's right.
So when you're not writing novels, you're writing Substack posts. And how does the university feel about all this? They encourage you to be creative.
Oh, the university doesn't encourage me to do anything. They don't encourage or discourage. They just hand me a paycheck a couple times a month, and
Uh,
yeah,
what is
how I
your
like it.
role? What is your role at the university?
I teach in a fantastic program, and it's not affiliated with any one department. It's a master's program. It's called the Masters of Liberal Arts program at Stanford, and it's great. It's a multidisciplinary humanities program, and it tends to draw, I would say, non-traditional graduate students in the sense that people a little bit older than right out of college, and it's essentially I teach a year-long sequence of a great books program in history, literature, philosophy, art, and as a result of that, people come to this program not because they want to get a specific degree, to get a
Right.
specific job, right, or get a raise. Instead, they want to do it because there's something missing, right, in a rich, meaningful life, and they realize that maybe reading some old books together might help with that quest. So I get fantastic students, and it kind of I like to think it runs a bit against the grain of the prevailing culture at Stanford and Silicon Valley. So we're a happy little outlier.
I'd probably enroll if I weren't already doing the same thing
Yeah, I think you've
right
got it
here.
covered. Yeah.
I know. I often thought when I went to my 45th reunion, I'd had a conversation after a seminar about, why didn't I have master's degrees, but not a PhD, and why didn't I come back to Stanford? And I said the truth was I couldn't think of anything I cared enough about to spend 2 or 3 years of my life writing it. I mean, why? It wouldn't do me any good at all. Um, and I just didn't think I could devote, especially at my age. I don't think 3 years of my life when I started at 85 is a great investment in a degree that would not particularly enhance my life. So there we are. Uh,
Yeah, it's got to
but
be
I,
for an ends unto itself. But it sounds like you're reading great books and having great conversations on the regular.
every
So
day.
yeah,
I
yeah.
know,
Hats
every
off to you.
day. I'm going to email you a reading list because I just read one of the best books ever, and you will love it. It's 1901 London and set in the Inns of Court. And it is on every level. It's just amazing. It's the second book, actually, and you will love them.
Oh,
So
fantastic. What's it called?
the first one's called A Case of Mice and Murder. Sally Smith is the is the author, and the second one is A Case of Something. I just gave it to my husband to read because he had surgery today, so I need him to like go to bed, actually, lie down and read something. I did a Zoom event with her. I did her US debut, and I'm probably going to do it again in November. But there are so many things that we've talked about that you would absolutely love. So I'll drop you a note and you
Yeah,
can do
please
that.
do.
So we should call Patrick up to see if he's listening in or if anybody else is listening in and would like to ask questions. I'm going to look up Sally Smith's second book here while you're doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly listening in. There are, and a number of other people are as well. Trying to see if there are any specific questions. But one thing I just wanted to bring up is, that period in Hollywood in the 30s has always, ever since I've kind of read a little bit more about it, I always find that fascinating, how much the German aesthetic played a role in film noir, for instance.
Yeah.
And you think about Fritz Lang, and I
Yeah,
mean, Hollywood was thick with Germans, right, in the 30s.
it really was. Yeah.
Correct.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fritz Lang is perfect example. I think he wised up and got out even long before the Nazis showed up, I think, or maybe right when they did. He was weirdly married to Thea von Harbe, who herself became a kind of Nazi screenwriter, and I guess Hitler broke their marriage.
Yeah, it's fascinating period, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm just putting a light on, so I realize that I'm getting ensconced in darkness here as the
No, you're
sun goes
doing fine.
down.
I looked up Sally, and her second case book is called A Case of Life and Limb, but I will email you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Oh, so good. Anyway, sorry, Patrick. Do we have anybody listening?
Let's see. Yeah. You've actually answered the questions though. There were questions about what you taught at Stanford. Um, are there other, in addition to the great books thing, what else have you taught, or what's your sort of area of emphasis?
Yeah, so I my training, I got my PhD at Stanford too, and so I focused on modern European history, late 19th, early 20th century thought and literature. So the couple of courses I still teach in continuing studies are more focused on that. So I teach a course called one is called Modernity and its Discontents, and that is features, works by say Freud. Of course, I'm plagiarizing his title, Civilization's Discontents, for the course title, and we read Simone Weil and Ernst Jünger and Jose Ortega y Gasset and Sartre and Beauvoir, things like that. I also teach a course called Modernism in the Metropolis, which covers similar ground, but the approach is a little bit different. And that one, I essentially take students on armchair travel to different European cities, and so we start. I've taught a number of different ways, as far back as starting in Paris with the French Revolution, and then going through the 19th century to various kind of capitals of cultural ferment along the way. So we're in Berlin for Romanticism, and then we'll come back to Berlin for the Weimar period. We're in turn of the century Vienna. We're in 1860s St. Petersburg with Dostoevsky and Turgenev. I have gone to Madrid. In any event, the idea is I give a kind of rich contextual lecture of the history and climate of the city, and then have a couple key readings, and we look at a lot of work of art. So you get this sense of a kind of synchronic things are happening at the same time in a distinct place with a distinct kind of atmosphere. That's a lot of fun to do.
That sounds wonderful. Do you know the course I remember most clearly at Stanford was I took an entire quarter taught by a wonderful professor, trying to remember his name, Heinrich, I think something. Anyway, the entire course was reading Goethe's Faust. That's all
Oh,
we
wow.
we read
Nice.
Faust from all the way through, and every everything we discussed related to the whole Romantic period and Germany. So you wound up in music, you wound up in myth, you wound up in so many things. And I remember it seemed like such a luxury to focus on just one work for an entire quarter.
It really is. I think that's a great approach, and it's kind of a dying one. I'm guilty too whisking us through book to book, week to week, when we could spend whole quarters on any one of these. But yeah, I did that a couple times in college and really relished it. And I think I don't know. I think at least teachers and administrators think that the attention span is so withered and degraded at this point that people wouldn't go for it. But I also think then there's a bit of playing into what people think people would want or don't want, and then they stop offering it when it might be really well received and fantastic. And just like you said, you can do so much by having one book as your anchor and then going all the way from there.
Could be
Think
an
about all the
excellent
reverb.
antidote to splintering attention too, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Patrick, I didn't mean
Oh,
to
no,
say
I was
that.
just going to say a story like that too has so many reverberations and has been, it's maybe a universal story that keeps coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
and it was also, the break from the 18th century and a much more philosophical, whatever, into romanticism. And it's hard to understand the 19th century if you don't really understand the romantic movement.
Yeah, I remember reading just recently for Leslie Klinger's annotated version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and reading that now as opposed to when I first read it when I was in my teens or whatever. And wow, there's talk about a book that is, man, I mean, that slim little book is such a primary story that keeps getting reinterpreted and, the whole shadow side and
yeah.
fascinating stuff.
I don't think I've read that since I was a kid either. That sounds like a good
Reread
one to
it.
revisit.
Check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was blown away by it.
I've often thought it'd be fun to teach a course like Barbara, your Faust one, which was modeled just over Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, and follow its kind of predecessors and reverberations. Faust would definitely be a good one to look at in conjunction with that too. Haven't mustered the wherewithal yet, but one day.
Do people still say Faustian bargain, or is that
I
is
do.
yeah,
I'm striking them all the time.
Yeah.
yeah, aren't we all?
Actually, what I think is interesting and came out of COVID, I think, when people, excuse me, had much more time to read, is a really awakening interest in Greek mythology and in the classics. And it's a huge thing. Now, when I was a kid, I had read my way through the grammar school library, and so they had an edition of Bulfinch's mythology that was in the teacher's library, but I had wiped out the entire school library. And so they gave it to me. So I memorized Bulfinch's mythology in the fifth grade. And that, I have to say, is one of the foundations of everything that I have learned and read since. If you really are anchored in the Greeks and the Greek myths and you understand, foibles and human behavior and, all these things that, come out of that. And I'm so pleased to see that there's been a renewed interest in it. People are telling new stories. A lot of it's feminist. A lot of it is feminist reinterpretations of the Greek myths. But, I love it. I think it's so good that we're kind of going back to that.
And good for
Yeah.
Percy Jackson, I mean, introducing kids to a whole
I will never forget walking along in El Paso with Rick when he said to me, because he'd written crime novels, he'd written a bunch of paper, and he said to me, Barbara, he said, I was reading my child story the other night out of whatever Greek, like Bullfinch or something. And he looked at me, he said, do you think that there would be any interest in retelling Greek myths for kids? It's a pivotal moment. What if I'd said no? And I
Well,
said yes.
my
I
my
did.
niece is a huge Percy Jackson fan.
Well, but
Yeah.
that's what he was thinking about. Should he do that? He was a teacher and he'd written some great crime fiction. And if he was going to do it, he could see that it was a real fork in the road.
Wow. Huh. Yeah, in this novel, I didn't even really think about it at the time, but it's kind of clear as day on the page. And on hindsight, is I was definitely channeling the Odyssey. There's something of a kind of the similar kind of narrative moves of the Odyssey and a kind of Odysseus-like figure coming to back that I realized was it's like you say, is they provide these kind of undercurrents and structure and storytelling that can be incredible kind of instruments in helping us tell stories and then tap uh, into some of these larger reverberations. And so I found myself, yeah, telling an Odyssey that will not connect with young readers or sell millions and millions of copies in the way Percy Jackson did, but an Odyssey nonetheless.
A question that's come in is, are any of your classes available online?
Uh, no, not yet. I mean, there were the Zoom years or during the pandemic where I taught them online, but I didn't.
Didn't
I'm not
record them?
savvy enough to record them in order to package. I'm not sure Stanford would allow me to. Um,
Yeah.
but so the short answer is no, but it's a good idea. Maybe one day.
Anything else, Patrick?
That's about it. Let me
All
just
right.
check real quick with YouTube. No, that's about it.
All right. Well, let me remind people that we had a very interesting conversation, the three of us, in 2022 about The Torqued Man, which was Peter's first novel, first published novel anyway. And you can go back and listen to that because there were all kinds of great things we talked about. And it's been a real pleasure to talk about World Specific and this book. So let's keep at it. As you develop more, we can do this again. I'll,
Sounds
I'll
like a
send
plan.
you, I'll send you the links to this conversation as well. So then you'll have them for your social media.
That's great.
Which would be great. Right. So thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Bye.
Take care. Thanks.